Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO, and your host. Today, Dr. Claudia Lugo-Candelas will present Prenatal Exposures and Experiences, Impact on Children's Early Brain Development and Risk for Disease. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 180 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the Foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has such a great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $430 million to fund more than 6,000 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Claudia Lugo-Candelas. Dr. Lugo-Candelas is Assistant Professor of Clinical Medical Psychology at Columbia University Medical Center and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. She was a 2019 BBRF Young Investigator. Once our webinar will begin with the presentation, which will then be followed by question and answers. To submit your questions, please use the question tab on the panel on your screen. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as time allots. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Lugo-Candelas. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It is a delight to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Let me get my slides sorted. Today, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of my work surrounding prenatal exposures and experiences and how that impacts brain development early on in life and eventual risk for disease. So here's our roadmap of where we're going. We're going to start talking about the prenatal origins of health and disease, followed by some of our studies of the early origins of ADHD. We're going to be focusing a lot on one prenatal origin or prenatal exposure, which is prenatal sleep. And then we're going to pivot to really talking and thinking about who amongst us gets to sleep. We're going to finalize the presentation with thinking about the importance of thinking about ADHD intergenerationally. Okay. So here are some terms that I'm going to be using throughout this talk. Prenatal, when I say prenatal, I'm meaning about things that happen in pregnancy. So I'm going to be talking about everything that happens in that pregnancy right up until birth. Postnatal is referring from that birth onwards. And perinatal is just kind of this catch-all term that really encompasses the whole period before and after pregnancy. I'm also going to be using sometimes the term in utero, and that literally means inside the uterus. So it's going to be referring to the things that happen when that developing fetus is inside mom's belly. Okay, so to put a little bit of context, in the last decades, the idea that development begins before birth has gained a lot of traction. The hypotheses that the exposures and experiences that happen prenatally could impact the development of organs and tissues in important ways that carry on into adulthood was formalized by David Barker. And in its origins, this hypothesis was really focused around physical health outcomes. The prime example is the Dutch hunger winter study. And in the winter spring of 1944, the German occupation limited the amount of food that could come into the western region of the Netherlands, including Amsterdam. But that resulted in that people, including pregnant people, could get as few as 400 to 800 calories per day, which represents significant undernourishment. And the first thing that was found was that babies born in that period, so babies who were exposed to that undernourishment in pregnancy were born underweight. However, as these babies became adults, what the study started documenting was elevated rates of obesity and cardiovascular disease, which sounds a little bit contradictory, but that's where this hypothesis comes from. And the idea is that there was an inappropriate adaptation to that undernourishment in pregnancy, such that that fetus was not prepared for a postnatal environment where food was abundant. And after the war was over, food rations were established to normal levels in this region, meaning that that baby could not adapt to then this increased level of nutrition in their environment. However, in the last decades, we've moved from looking exclusively at physical health to then thinking about the early origins of psychiatric illness. And the prime example of these studies are studies that look at prenatal maternal depression and distress. And what they found is that offspring of people who are depressed in their pregnancy or undergoing a lot of distress are at a higher rate, are higher risk for negative outcomes. And here I'm going to show you this very busy slide, but I'm only going to point out a couple of things. I hope that you can see my cursor. What I'm going to be showing you is in this slide, we're looking at the exposure here of psychological distress during pregnancy. And overall, what I'm trying to convey is that there's a ton of ways and mechanisms by which psychological distress in pregnancy could result in negative outcomes for that developing child. It could be, I'm on the bottom lower left, that there's adaptations in that maternal body, such as activation of the stress system, the immune system, and I'm going to be coming back to these things. It could also be that there's effects in that placenta that impact that developing brain inside the uterus. I'm going to be focusing on one primary outcome here, and that is ADHD. However, before I go forward, I do want to stop here and very explicitly say that when I'm talking about risk for a disorder, I am not talking about the definite outcome of the disorder. So here I'm going to be talking about things that are associated to risk for ADHD. That in no way means that if one is exposed to any of the exposures that I'm going to be talking about, one is 100% going to have ADHD. It merely increases the risk, and that's what we're going to be looking at, increases in risk for ADHD. So let's talk a little bit about ADHD quite quickly. It is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder and it affects roughly 10% of children in the US, although estimates can vary. It is characterized by difficulties with attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. When we think about the attention piece of ADHD, we're really talking about difficulties sustaining and controlling that attention. And some of the symptoms include things like trouble holding attention on the things that we're doing, trouble organizing oneself, being easily distracted, or being very forgetful. The hyperactivity and impulsivity end of things looks a little bit like being very fidgety or squirmy, unable to do things quietly, acting on the go or as if driven by a motor, and difficulty kind of controlling ourselves and waiting for one's turn. It's a disorder of childhood. That's how it's conceptualized until right now, meaning that for ADHD to be diagnosed right now, there needs to be evidence that some of the symptoms were present before the child was 12 years of age. There needs to be distress and impairment. The thing about ADHD, as many other disorders, is that the causes, or what we call the etiology, remains largely unknown. ADHD is largely heritable, meaning it runs in families. However, the studies that have looked at the whole genome really can only account for 20% of that transmission in recent estimates. And there's other studies showing that environmental influences are thought to really be a big part of that transmission or of that risk. Today, I'm going to be talking about the prenatal environment and its influences and thinking about risk for ADHD. I am particularly going to be talking about prenatal maternal sleep. Just, for everyone, sleep changes in pregnancy. Sleep can change throughout pregnancy due to a number of different factors. Those include reproductive hormones, needing to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, body aches, pains, etc. The pattern that is most commonly seen is that, and if you can see this graph, is that at the beginning, the first trimester, sleep actually increases. This is the 0. You can think about this as the baseline, is that sleep increases at the beginning of pregnancy, but then as pregnancy continues, it slowly starts reducing in total length, but also it starts becoming much more fragmented. Sleep loss can place that pregnant person and their offspring at a risk for negative outcomes. To date, there is a significant body of literature showing that a lot of sleep loss, so more than your average sleep loss, can place the pregnant person and their child at risk for more things related to birth. So lower birth rate, shorter gestational age, and then birth complications. However, what about the long-term effects on children's development? If you think about it, that developing fetus, a third of its life in utero, it is exposed to a sleeping person. So if that pregnant person isn't sleeping, that's a third of that fetus's development that's exposed to something different. We know that sleep impacts all of our healths, but there's plenty of research to show that maternal health is not the exception. Sleep impacts things like the immune system, which can cause more inflammation. Sleep can also impact our stress system, which we call the HPA axis. So if you have a pregnant person who's not sleeping or sleeping very poorly, it is not difficult to imagine that activation of that stress system and of that inflammatory system can mean that that fetus is exposed to more cortisol, which is a stress hormone, or cytokines, which are inflammatory proteins. And the thing is, both of those exposures can impact where that fetus is developing, that placenta, and that intrauterine environment, and impact that developing brain. Rodent studies have tried to understand this, and what they've come with all sorts of different methods to mimic sleep loss in pregnancy. This is one of them, where a rodent is placed in a little platform, and when that rodent falls too deeply asleep, they will fall off the platform due to the loss of muscle tension and fall into the water. So their sleep is very disrupted often, and that can mimic what that third trimester looks like for many pregnant people. What these studies have found is that indeed that uterus and that intrauterine environment is more inflamed when there's been a lot of sleep loss in that pregnancy. Likewise, they have found that offspring of those sleep-deprived rodents are more active. So that's like a model of hyperactivity, which, as I mentioned, is a symptom of ADHD. They've also found decreased hippocampal neurogenesis, so less birth of neurons in the hippocampus. And also, consequently, they found that there's smaller hippocampal volumes in the offspring of sleep-deprived rodents. So let's talk for a moment about the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a small but mighty structure. It is deep in the temporal lobe, and it's really important for learning and memory. That's what most folks kind of associate it with, but it's also highly implicated in psychiatric disorders. It is very critical to a process known as emotion regulation. Emotion regulation is the process by which we control which, how, and when emotions are both experienced and expressed. As you can imagine, being able to control our emotions and be able to regulate our emotions is highly important. Many psychiatric disorders involve difficulties with emotion regulation. So some research supports this idea in saying that smaller hippocampal volumes are detected in children with ADHD. And here I'm just in that box, I've just highlighted that. These are showing reductions in children and adolescents with ADHD in their hippocampal volumes. The other important thing to note is that emotion regulation abilities are often impaired in ADHD, and they can be a source of significant impairment. So if you think about some of the difficulties that people with ADHD in childhood can face, those include difficulties with peer relationships, with aggression, and emotion regulation is a skill that's highly important to be able to regulate our overall behavior and really important to our functioning. So what do the studies on prenatal sleep and ADHD in humans have to say? For one, there's only a small handful of these studies. There's only 3 that have looked at whether prenatal sleep is as related to ADHD. And in my view, the most impressive is the study of an Italian cohort of pregnant people and their offspring. And they looked at, this is a very busy table. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. They looked at anxiety, sleep disorders, and depression in pregnancy, and then how that was related to hyperactivity and then inattentive symptoms in offspring. What they found was that sleep disorders during pregnancy were related to a 40% increase in symptoms of hyperactivity in offspring, and 25% increase in symptoms of inattentiveness, although the inattentive symptoms were not significant after adjusting for other things like maternal smoking during pregnancy. There's a couple of other studies that have looked at this issue, and overall, what they suggest is that prenatal sleep may be related to offspring risk for ADHD, but we still don't know how this happens. And this is when my 2019 BBRF Young Investigator Award came in. In this award, we were aiming to examine if prenatal maternal sleep impacts newborn brain development and risk for ADHD. I attempted to fill in 4 main gaps via the study. The first one is understanding the neural markers. So really getting at the idea of how is prenatal sleep impacting that developing brain. To do this, we use a technique called neonatal neuroimaging. Neuroimaging is the same as MRI. Perhaps you've seen an MRI or you've gone inside an MRI. An MRI is this donut-shaped machine that one is split into, and it basically takes pictures, high-quality pictures of the insides of our bodies. In this case, we use it to take pictures of the brain. However, we use it to take pictures of babies' brains, and we conduct these MRI scans when children are 2 to 4 weeks of age. Here, I'm showing you a mock. This is a doll, and as you can see, this doll, if it were a baby, it would be naturally sleeping. These are non-sedated infants. These are naturally sleeping babies. They're kind of swaddled up. We protect their hearing because the MRI makes funky noises, and then as that baby is sleeping, we take pictures of their brain. We use neonatal neuroimaging to understand prenatal risk independent from postnatal exposures. By imaging that brain when it's just been born, 2 to 4 weeks of age, we can significantly minimize exposure to the postnatal world and all of its influences on our brain. The next gap that we're attempting to fill is how would things look like if you measured sleep objectively? So all the studies that I've previously shown you are studies that look at maternal reports of their own sleep. And here's the thing, we might not be great at reporting our own sleep. When you're thinking about measuring sleep for a study, there's two ways that you can do it. One is you can just ask participants, right? And you can ask them to jot down when they went to bed, when they woke up. You can ask them to rate their overall quality. You can also measure sleep. And there's many ways of measuring sleep, but a way that we use in our large cohorts is through actigraphy. And what I'm showing you here is a little actigraphy device. It looks like a watch. It's kind of like a Fitbit. You wear it and it measures things like activity, like when you move, it measures light exposure, and it tries to figure out when you're sleeping. So in a cohort of pregnant people, they found that used both methods at the same time, they found that 62% of pregnant people reported sleep times that differed by more than 1 hour from the ones that the actigraphy device measured. 39% of people overestimated how much they slept, and then 23% underestimated how much they were sleeping. And the thing is that self-reports and these objective sleep measures may be related to different things. So the difference between, for folks that are saying I'm sleeping a lot less than I actually am, or vice versa, that difference may be related to different things. So it may be related to depression, or it may be more of a measure of how distressed you are about sleep. And to us, that matters because we need to know what to target in interventions. If we find, for example, that what's related to offspring risk for ADHD is, helping moms get to bed earlier, fall asleep quicker, that's one intervention. If it's actually that distress related to sleep, that's a different kind of intervention. So we need to know what we're targeting. The next gap, as I mentioned before, is the mechanisms underlying that association. We're really interested in seeing whether it's, immune system getting activated, or if it's that stress system activated and how that's impacting that brain. And the last thing is thinking about offspring sex. So it turns out that if you're thinking about prenatal exposures, you really want to be thinking about the impact of the offspring sex, because it turns out that the sex of the offspring may actually impact how much that exposure affects it. So there's many reasons here and many possible mechanisms, but just to think about one, the male and the female placenta are actually different and may respond differently to prenatal exposures. And so you may find that the same exposure has different impacts depending on the offspring sex. So jumping to our results, here I'm going to be showing you the results of our first analyses looking at prenatal sleep and offspring hippocampal volumes. And what I'm going to be, what our main finding was that there was an interaction between offspring sex and maternal reports of sleep quality. What that means is that the relationship between prenatal maternal sleep quality and hippocampal volume depended on that infant sex. For males, we found no relationship between maternal sleep and their hippocampus. However, for females, worse sleep quality predicted smaller hippocampal volumes. We also looked at the amygdala. The amygdala, these were more exploratory analyses. We looked at the amygdala because the amygdala is another structure that's super important to emotion regulation. And super interestingly here, what we found was that where sleep quality was associated to greater amygdala volume only for males, not in females. So what about behavior and what about risk for ADHD? These children that were scanned as 2-week-olds were then followed until they were 2 years of age. And we asked parents to report on their behaviors and their symptoms. What we found was that maternal reports of sleep quality in their pregnancy, we're still talking about sleep in pregnancy, that was now associated to children's own sleep problems. So worse maternal sleep quality and more sleep disturbances related to more sleep problems in those 2-year-olds. We also found that maternal reports of their sleep duration, so how long they slept, was related to poor emotion regulation, but only for males. So for males, there was a shorter sleep duration related to more difficulties with emotion regulation. So what about the objective sleep assessments? So we're still working through this, and we only have a subsample that are ready to go. But in this subsample, what we're seeing is that 75% of our pregnant people are off by more than 1 hour. So they're underestimating their sleep by around 1 hour. Yet, however, their duration of their sleep, the total duration of their sleep, is still related to hippocampal volumes. We found that less sleep duration, as measured by this actigraphy watch, was related to smaller hippocampal volumes. However, this we haven't quite looked at. We haven't split our sample and looked at the two offspring sex separately because of our sample being too small to do that yet. So a summary of up till now, what we have found is that prenatal maternal sleep may impact that development of that brain in the uterus in sex-specific ways. It's possible that males may be more affected in their emotional regulation abilities, which, as we noted before, are associated to amygdala structure and function, and also a significant area of impairment in ADHD. However, females may be just at risk for sleep difficulties in general, and that may itself carry further on risk for negative mental health outcomes in life, because we know that sleep difficulties can be related to things like depression and anxiety. However, there's more questions than answers and many things that we still are planning to do. We really want to get at these mechanisms and look at that inflammation and HPA axis data. We haven't done that yet. We're still collecting that data. I'm really interested in that because we're hoping that it's going to help us understand why we see these sex differences. So why is it that for males, it's the amygdala, for females, the hippocampus? We're hoping that in seeing those mechanisms, we can clarify why those differences exist. I'm really interested to, what's going to happen to these babies when they continue to age, particularly when that finding of their own sleep. So there's a growing body of literature that shows that you may start seeing sleep difficulties before you start seeing ADHD. So I wonder if that is what's happening here, is that maternal sleep impacts risk for ADHD by impacting children's own sleep. And that's really interesting because that points out a possible target for intervention. We can help children sleep better. We can do that. Other questions that we have around trimester-specific effects. So is there a trimester in which sleep matters more? Can we say, all pregnant people should be really trying to get their best rest at whatever trimester? That's really important for us to know as well. And then, we can move into implementing interventions. There's treatments out there for sleep. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is just one of them, and it is an evidence-based way of helping people sleep. Can we implement that in pregnancy and see if not only it helps that pregnant person, but then their offspring as well? Okay, so now we're going to pivot. Now we're going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to start talking about really thinking. We've come to the conclusion that sleep matters. We've come to the conclusion that it matters not only for that. We know it matters not only for that pregnant person. It may also matter for that next generation. But now we really need to think about, okay, who amongst us gets to rest? And the thing is that, like many other things in our society, sleep is not equally distributed. There's significant differences among different groups and communities in sleep, and that's what we call a disparity. Today, I'm going to be focusing on minoritized ethnic and racial groups, as these groups appear to be getting less and poorer sleep. And the reasons underlying those differences are surely multiple and they are complex, but several studies have now found that experiences of racism and discrimination are related to worse sleep health. And on the right side here, I'm showing you the cover of this book. It's called The Social Epidemiology of Sleep. I cannot recommend this book enough if you are interested in this topic. If you're interested in the question of who amongst us gets to sleep and what are the determinants, things like, which kinds of work lead to better sleep, how does race, how does ethnicity, how does socioeconomic status. This book is really approachable, it's very readable, but it's also very complete, so I highly recommend it. I'm gonna leave it there. So we became really interested in trying to understand, we know that sleep is important for the developing fetus, who gets to sleep? And we started doing our studies within our cohorts and looking at race disparities in prenatal sleep among Puerto Rican women. Our cohort is a sample comprised of pregnant Puerto Rican women. They're both in the South Bronx and in nearby areas, also in the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And what we found was that, here I'm just showing you actually some actigraphy data. All those squiggly lines, that's what you get when you run, when someone wears a watch. In blue, you see first a nap, and then you see overnight sleep. That's just what that looks like. But what I really want to highlight here is that using actigraphy devices, we found within our participants that women who identified as Black or as belonging to more than one race were showing shorter sleep duration than women who identified as white. So we see these disparities here even in a small sample size. We wanted to dig deeper into this, and we also started looking at our self-reports of maternal sleep. And here in a much larger sample, what we found was that women who identified as Black were telling us that it took them way longer to fall asleep compared to women who identified as more than one race. So here we have women who identify as Black showing an average of around 40 minutes to fall asleep versus 20 minutes. That is a significant difference. So we wanted to dig deeper and see, is our experiences of discrimination related to this difference that we see? And lo and behold, women who reported high levels of discrimination also reported that it was taking them longer to fall asleep compared to women who were reporting low or no levels of discrimination. This same kind of relationship was found among when looking at sleep quality. So when looking at mothers' overall report of their sleep quality, we found again that women who were reporting higher levels of discrimination were rating their sleep as poorer in quality. So we wanted to move a little bit. A little bit beyond interpersonal discrimination and really think about structural discrimination. And here I'm going to introduce this concept. Structural racism discrimination is the total amount of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems. And these systems include things like housing, education, employment, healthcare, etc. So here I'm oversimplifying and only choosing a couple of these, but the basic idea is that racism and discrimination can be built into our structures and can impact things like employment, healthcare, the neighborhood, where we live, what we eat, etc., etc. And that, if you note all of these things, one thing that they all have in common is that they have a big impact on our health and well-being. So here, these studies, we're only starting to conduct these studies, and we are starting to think about just one of these domains, looking at food security. A number of studies have found that racism and discrimination structurally mean that who you are can impact, and what your race is, your social economic status can impact what food is available to you and what food is in your environment. So here we asked our mothers to rate their environment for food security. So in this case, we're looking at food availability and security, where lower scores indicate lower food availability and security. And what we found is that women who identified as Black within our cohort were saying that there was less food availability in their environments compared to women who identified as white. So again, we see that when we look at discrimination, it is also related in the sense that women who report higher levels of discrimination also report less food availability in their environments. And then lo and behold, our very concerning findings, we find that food insufficiency is related to mothers' self-reported sleep duration during pregnancy, suggesting that mothers who live in environments where there's less food security sleep less. So here, what we're really highlighting is that structural manifestations of racism and discrimination can impact our health during pregnancy. It's specifically sleep health. So here, I'm just going to put it all together. And what I am showing here is that, there's discriminatory policies and systems such as that ultimately results in the unequal distribution of resources and opportunities, including employment, education, health resources, even the environment that we're exposed to. So for example, things like light, noise, air pollution, we know that all those impact our sleep. And that those discriminatory policies and systems mean that for discriminated people, that can look like the reduction of resources and services that they need for the health of that pregnant person and their developing infant. That can lead to increases in stress in that pregnant person and can lead to a host of changes in their body. That then can manifest as poor prenatal sleep health. In this case, as I've shown you, less duration. And then that can trigger a whole host of outcomes, such as I mentioned before, the activation of that immune system, of that stress system, which can then impact offspring via reduced hippocampal volumes and then difficulties with emotion regulation. All of this really to say that the impact of structural racism and discrimination may extend well beyond that one exposed pregnant individual and reach the next generation. So ourselves, we in our group, we are at the very beginning of this research, but things that we're thinking about is thinking again about those mechanisms. So what are the mechanisms underlying these associations? Thinking about which domains are most important. So when you think about a pregnant person and their developing fetus, is it healthcare? Is it housing? Is it all these things that equally contribute? That can start to point. And we're really interested in examining what are those factors that foster resilience. So what are those things that can really impact resilience, both in resilience, we're thinking about it, can buffer that impact and really lead families to thrive. We can think about factors that foster resilience both in pregnancy, so factors that can shield that pregnant person from structural racism and discrimination and kind of help them have healthy sleep habits nonetheless. Those can look like support from a family, from a community. Resilience can also be thought out in early development for that child. If that child, even if they're exposed to poor prenatal sleep, what are things within their communities, their schools, their systems that can help buffer those negative effects? However, we also need, we need to focus on resilience, but we really need to start thinking about structural interventions. As I've highlighted, it doesn't seem like it's just interpersonal experiences of racism. It seems like these are structural manifestations, and we need to think about structural interventions. And this can be a really daunting endeavor, but there's structural interventions, and just to name one, paid parental leave is a structural intervention that we can think about, really important to improving the lives of pregnant people and their families. So as I start slowly wrapping up, one thing that I want to think about is kind of for a couple of moments help us think about why should we care about the fetal origins of ADHD. So ADHD is a disorder which in and of its own right can bring significant impairment with the symptoms that I've previously shown. However, there's a whole host of cascading things that can happen. So when we think about impairment, we can think about, in childhood, we think about things that that can come along with the disorder as, things like academic underachievement, difficulties with relationships, with self-esteem. However, we continue to see this cascade in adolescence, and that can look like increased risk for injuries, driving accidents, riskier decisions, early initiation of substance use. In adulthood, we continue to see this risk, and these can look like occupational underattainment, social isolation, difficulty maintaining healthy behaviors. And really, the point here is that when we think about understanding the fetal origins of ADHD, what we're really talking about is learning how to identify the children that will be at the highest need for support and help prevent this cascade. In thinking about the cascade that can follow an ADHD diagnosis, one of our studies is suggesting that beyond what I just showed you in that previous slide, we can think about ADHD as something that might increase risk for future adversity. In our study, in our intergenerational study of Puerto Rican families, we found, led by Drs. Duarte and Ganino, children and parents were followed for approximately 3 years, just in this little piece that I'm talking about right here. And over those 3 years, both ADHD symptoms and adversities were measured. And when we talk about adversities in childhood, we're talking about things like maltreatment, parent maladjustment, separation, all things that are known to, that can happen in childhood and are known to impact children's development. And what we find, this is a bit of a busy graph here, but what we found was that compared to children that did not have ADHD, children that had ADHD at that initial baseline time point were at an increased risk for experiencing future adversity 3 years later. Here, what we're highlighting is that, when we think about ADHD, we really need to start thinking about cycles and developmental trajectories, really highlighting the need for intervention, treatment, and support for that entire family. So I am about to wrap up. I'm going to leave some time for questions, but I'm just going to very briefly summarize what we've spoken about today and say that, poor prenatal maternal sleep health may be an important risk factor for ADHD. We really need to focus on understanding the mechanisms underlying this association. And I keep saying mechanisms, because we need to move from understanding to intervening. And without understanding the mechanisms, we really don't know what we're supposed to be, targeting. We join a call that is global, but very prominent right now, especially in the context of the pandemic, that we really need to increase that support, that perinatal support for families. That is the way in which we can support not only people that are pregnant throughout that time, but we're also supporting the development of that next generation. So really critical. But then we need to understand, sleep is critical, but social racism discrimination may determine who gets to sleep. And it's critical for us to understand how that structural manifestation impacts sleep, because that's going to be critical to designing and implementing interventions that are aimed at achieving sleep equity and aimed at stopping the effects of discrimination on mothers and children's health. So with that, I'm going to briefly do some acknowledgements. The first acknowledgement is to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, not only for having me today and for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research, but really for their outstanding work funding young investigators. When I received this award 2 years ago, it started opening a lot of doors for me, and to this day it continues to open doors. And the work that the foundation does with early investigators is critical and highly needed. It's really important for young investigators, for foundations, especially prestigious foundations, to take a chance and fund our research, even if we're really on in development, and even if it's a crazy idea. This is, it's how innovation happens. So really, I just want to thank the foundation. I want to thank the rest of my funders, and I want to thank all my colleagues and collaborators at Columbia, at the Center for Generational Psychiatry, our collaborators elsewhere, and then all my lab members. With that, oh, and last but certainly not least, the families in all of our studies for trusting us so much. So, and thank you to the audience for being here, hanging around. I look forward to answering some questions. So leave this here.
Well, Claudia, thank you for the work that you're doing and for really an outstanding presentation. You're able to bring together so many aspects, from clinical work to basic research to society issues that affects people's health. So thank you for bringing all of that together in such a coherent way. I have a feeling there may be some people in our audience who are pregnant or planning on getting pregnant or have relatives who are pregnant. So what do you advise them at this point? What should they do to make sure they're getting adequate sleep and adequate care?
So I think, one of I always, this is something that, in my second slide, the first thing that, you should think about is that don't go running off if you're getting less sleep than you used to, because like I showed, that's part of pregnancy. And everyone who's been pregnant knows that your sleep is going to go through changes. So there's no need to sound the alarms. And again, we're talking about a risk for a disorder. So even if you're not getting great sleep, there's no need to sound the alarms. But what you do want to do is you want to find ways of maintaining healthy sleep. And, the first thing that I would advise you if you're concerned about your sleep is to talk to your providers, talk to your doctors, and really bring it up. I don't think that it is routine for doctors to be asking about sleep all the time. So if they don't ask, bring it up, start a conversation. There's tons of things that you can do to improve your sleep. And there's things that you can do without needing to see a sleep doctor or without needing to take medications or going to treatment. There's these things called sleep hygiene. And these are very simple things that we can do to improve. Anyone can do them. Anyone here on this talk, whether they're having great or poor sleep, whether they're pregnant or not, they can really start doing these things. And I encourage you, you can, a quick Google search might turn them up. Some of them, for example, are try to go to bed and wake up at the same time every day. Try to decrease your electronics use several hours before you go to bed. Try to think about not eating right before you go to bed. These are all things that all of us can do to improve our sleep in our daily lives. But again, if you're concerned about how much you're sleeping, talk to your doctor. There's certainly things that can be done.
Thank you for excellent response to an important question that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. Also, I want to ask you, in terms of factors that can foster resilience, you spoke a little bit about that. I'd like you to speak a little bit more, especially if somebody is pregnant right now. We all are hoping that we could start to address issues of structural racism. But for a person who's pregnant today, that may not get fixed in time. What should a person do right now to enhance their resilience when faced with issues of structural racism that you so nicely pointed out, the impact that it could have on the pregnant woman and also on the unborn child?
No, absolutely. So, the study of resilience is really burgeoning right now. It's really growing right now. And there are some things that seem to be coming up again and again. So when we think about things that can impact, and we're thinking in the life of a pregnant person, what could help them cope with the world, with their experience of the world, with the way in which institutions are treating them. And one of the things that keeps coming up again and again is support. And that support can come from a whole host of different sources. But one of the things that helps is to have folks, in this case, when we're talking about race, folks that look like you, folks that go through the same sort of experiences as you go through, having those folks in your life and seeking support from them. Some of the things that, depending on culture and cultural norms, but for example, in our Latino communities, we know that family is, one of the pillars, if not the center of our lives. So we find, for example, that in our Puerto Rican samples, family is a big source of support, and feeling connected to that family, feeling like you're in the same boat, all those things can help kind of foster your resilience. So I would say seek out communities, and communities can look very differently. Communities can be literally your neighborhood, they can be your family, they can be, if you're a religious person, they can be your church, they can be your temple. These are all sorts of communities that can help you foster resilience. In terms of, that's for the pregnant person. In terms of, there's more than one place that we can think about foster resilience. We can also foster resilience in these children. So family support when it comes to raising healthy children cannot be underestimated. Having important figures be a part of that child's life, having them help in the upbringing, that really is not to be undervalued. Thinking about, communities around school and daycare, all those things and all that involvement can really foster resilience.
Good, thank you. I want to ask you a little bit about other steps that the pregnant person can take in terms of vitamins, such as vitamin D, other vitamins, diet. Could you speak a little bit about the importance of those aspects as well?
Absolutely. So we know that nutrition and physical activity are really important to sleep. So maintaining a healthy diet, and again, thinking about, if you want to think particularly to sleep, you want to eat a well-balanced diet that, hits all of your vitamins and all your minerals, but you want to think about two things in terms of diet. There's other things that you may want to think about, but you want to think about, in terms of sleep, your caffeine. So how much caffeine are you ingesting and when you're ingesting it? And that, around pregnancy, people do tend to decrease their caffeine consumption. But if you think about people who aren't pregnant, think about your caffeine intake. When is that happening? If it's happening too late at night, it might be time to drop it. That might be interfering with sleep. But then think about, like I mentioned earlier, eating too late at night may impact your ability to fall asleep for a while. So you do want to think about that and maybe eat a little bit earlier. The next thing that cannot be underemphasized is physical activity. Physical activity is great for sleep. It's great for overall health, but it is really great for sleep. So I would really, and there is, obviously, this is a conversation that you want to have with your doctor, but there is, for most pregnancies, there is the ability to stay active. There's plenty of exercises that can be done during pregnancy in most pregnancies. So think about those two lifestyle things, that they may really help your overall health, and they may help your ability to sleep.
Good, excellent. And let me ask you, if the mother, we all have stress at different points in our life, and pregnancy can be a stressful time. What do you say to a pregnant woman if they are feeling stressed due to things in society, due to things in their own life? What should they do above and beyond the things that you've said already, of making use of their support system? What else can they do to help manage stress?
Absolutely. So, one of the first things that we want to think about is that, stress is normal. We need some level of stress in our lives to, get us out of bed and remember to do this, remember to do the other. So there are some levels of stress that are, normal and necessary. But, if you start seeing that you can't think because of stress, you can't sleep at night, you're constantly worried, you're not in the moment, it may be time to, the first thing that I can say is it may be time to talk to your provider. Your provider in pregnancy is a very difficult time. And pregnancy, not only because there's a baby on the way, and that is very stressful, but there's also hormones that are changing in your body, and that in and of itself can increase your stress levels. So your provider in pregnancy is equipped, or should be equipped, to handle discussions around stress, because the same way that they're going to be talking to you, for example, about lower back pain, which is a part of pregnancy or can be a part of pregnancy, they should also be equipped to talk about stress and talk about your options. You're not alone. A lot of pregnant people experience stress in pregnancy, and there's certainly things that can be done about that. There's treatments, and you may think about different types of treatments. Some people may opt for medications. Some people may opt for talk therapy. There's effective and fast acting that can really help you deal with the stress here and the now. So I would really encourage people to talk to their providers. But then at home, there's certain things that you can do on yourself. And we're thinking about being a pregnant person in the world right now. I just can't shake the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of a pandemic that is more dangerous for pregnant people. So I would highly recommend that, to the point that you can, try to disconnect a little bit from the world and all the negativity or all the stressors that we're seeing right now. Take care of yourself in your pregnancy as you can. Try to disengage, stay alert and stay involved. But, there's this term called doom scrolling. We're in our phones and we just see negative out of negative news. It may be a moment to take a step back. Remember that you're creating a human being. So you're already doing a lot. This might be the time where you take a step back. And aside from that, again, talk to your providers. This is a common experience of pregnancy. You're not alone, and there's things that can be done to help.
Claudia, what useful guidance and advice. I would say a lot of it, not just for pregnant people, but for all of us, but especially for pregnant people. So thank you for the work you're doing, for the work you're going to continue to do, and for an outstanding presentation today. I so very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who's hung around.
Yeah, well, I can't imagine anybody leaving given everything that you were saying, so thank you. And anybody who left didn't hear me say that. So thank you very much. I also want to thank everybody who did join us for today's presentation. All of the research that we fund is made possible by donations from people like you. $100, 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants, because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a gift, please visit our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call us at 800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share it with family and friends, please visit the events and webinars page on our website. I'd like to invite you to join us for our next webinar, which will be on February 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Nii Addy, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Cellular and Molecular Physiology at Yale School of Medicine, will present Investigating Neurobiology and New Treatments for Addiction, Depression, and Anxiety. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Once again, thank you very much.